on issues like immigration and the administration's response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. We are also following new developments in the showdown over who's the boss at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. After hearing from both sides yesterday at an emergency hearing, a federal judge will decide whether Trump Budget Director Mick Mulvaney or CFPB Deputy Director Leandra English has control of that agency. Former Director Richard Cordray, who picked English to take his place, tells our Rachel Maddow he believes the law is on his side.
There's an absence or unavailability of the director. The deputy director becomes the acting director. That's what Ms. English has now done. And this is the kind of disagreement that involves two different laws. They conflict with one another. The right place to hash that out is in the courts, which is where it is right now. It shouldn't be decided by name-calling and tweets and insults.
All right, let's bring in NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, this one is politically explosive. This agency is very dear to the hearts of Democrats. This is an Obama appointee stepping aside. Democrats very fearful of Mulvaney taking over. So the court's got to decide Mulvaney or English, the Republican or the Democrat, basically. Any clue where the court looks at this legally?
Well, the fact is that she has the tougher burden here, because when you're asking for something like this, a temporary restraining order, you have to have really have the evidence on your side. And the problem is there is a conflict between these two laws. And what the Justice Department says and the general counsel of the agency itself, they both say that, yes, it's true that the law that created the agency says the deputy shall become director when there's a vacancy. The fact is that another federal law, the Vacancy Reform Act, gives the president the option to put somebody else in if he wants. So it's an either-or for the president, not exclusively just the way it works inside the agency. That's the Justice Department's contention. The judge, I think, is going to rule pretty quickly here, Steve, on the short-term question of whether she gets this instant temporary victory, but then it'll play out for the next couple of the direction of this bureau, which you point out created in the Obama administration, is going to be changing under President Trump.
All right, Pete Williams, NBC News Justice correspondent. Pete, thanks for that. And I'm joined now by one of the key architects of the Dodd-Frank law, which set up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the first place, former Assistant Treasury Secretary Michael Barr. Michael, thank you for taking a few minutes. Let me ask you what Pete just laid out there. Maybe potentially here from a Cordray's standpoint, from the Obama administration standpoint, I guess the alumni standpoint, an uphill legal fight, and also, of course, the eventuality maybe of President Trump picking his own replacement, having the votes in the Senate to confirm that replacement. Do you view it as just a matter of time before basically the Trump administration has full control of this agency?
Well, I think the basic issue is that the administration needs to follow the law in having the president nominate a director and having that director confirmed by the Senate. And in the interim, the statute that set up the consumer agency is clear that the deputy director is the acting director of the agency. So I think it's about following the law, following the right process. At the end of the day, the president gets to nominate someone, and the Senate can make a decision about whether to confirm that person.
Well, and we know, again, going back to this whole Dodd-Frank fight now, it's been, what, 6 or 7 years, how important this agency was to a lot of Democrats, a lot of activists, a lot of people say, this was the thing Elizabeth Warren was originally supposed to lead. A lot of Democrats and activists, when that law was being created, thought this was one of the keys to making it successful. So if it does reach a point where the Trump administration gets its own person in there, whether it's through the courts, whether it's through a confirmation, what is that going to do to this agency that was so important to Democrats?
Well, look, the basic fact is this is an agency that has stood up and protected consumers since enactment in 2010. And it's returned over $12 billion in relief to consumers who've been harmed by the financial sector, by bad practices, by payday lenders, by institutions like Wells Fargo that set up fraudulent accounts. So this is an agency that's working. And I think that, you know, if I were in the position of the administration, I'd want to have an agency that continues to deliver for the American people.
All right, Michael Barr, one of the architects of the Dodd-Frank law, which gave us the CFPB. Michael, thank you for the time. Also, news to tell you about. ABC News is reporting that a lawyer for former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn met with members of Special Counsel Mueller's team on Monday. We are being cautious here because ABC did not cite any sources. NBC News has not verified this report, and when asked by NBC about it, Flynn's lawyer declined to comment. NBC's Ken Delanian joins us now. So, Ken, maybe smoke signals here, a lot of speculation. What do you make of this?
It bears repeating, Steve, that we have not confirmed this report. When I called Flynn's lawyer, Rob Kellner, about this, he didn't deny it, but he declined to comment. That said, I have no reason to doubt this report, and what I think it signals, along with some other reporting, is that that Flynn is pretty clearly on his way to cooperating, if not already cooperating, with Special Counsel Robert Mueller. And here's why that's hugely important. Mike Flynn was in every senior campaign meeting in the Trump campaign and many high-level meetings in the first few weeks of the Trump administration. He can answer some key questions in the Mueller investigation. If the Mueller investigation is investigating an alleged conspiracy, which many believe it is, of collusion with Russia, Mike Flynn would be a key alleged conspirator. He can answer, for example, did Donald Trump know and send him on an errand to talk to the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, which is what got Flynn in trouble in the first place when he lied about it, allegedly. And then he can answer the biggest question in the Mueller investigation, which is, was the Trump campaign coordinating with the Russians over those leaked Democratic emails that went to WikiLeaks and that the Trump campaign deployed? So his cooperation would be a huge break in this case, Steve.
In terms of his own exposure, his own vulnerability legally, in terms of if there is some sort of plea deal here, if that's where this ends up going, there also may be charges here, if I'm understanding this right, that Mueller would get him on that aren't related to the issue there of collusion potentially or conspiracy, but that give leverage to Mueller potentially. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. What we know from the public record is that Mike Flynn has a disclosure problem. There's a pattern of him failing to disclose foreign contacts and business entanglements, particularly on his security clearance form, according to lawmakers who have reviewed that form. Now, that can be a serious crime. It's not often prosecuted, but in the context of other information, it can be a serious crime. It's unrelated, obviously, to collusion with Russia. But just as in the case of Paul Manafort, who's been indicted on money laundering charges and failure to register as a foreign lobbyist, Mike Flynn could be facing these charges. Mike Flynn also has a foreign lobbying registration issue. And what's more, his son appears to have some legal exposure. His son was his right-hand person, helped him fill out forms, helped him arrange meetings. And, you know, that is an enormous pressure on a parent to have a son facing legal exposure, Steve.
All right, NBC's Ken Delanian with a story we are all going to be keeping our eyes on. Ken, thank you for that. From it, the Senate candidate in Alabama making his first campaign appearance in 11 days. And with 2 weeks now until the big vote there in Alabama, things are getting uglier by the day. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard is in the state this morning. He was at that Moore event last night. So, Vaughn, 2 weeks to go. I assume we're going to see Roy Moore a lot more in public now. What's the message here? Is he confronting these allegations head on, or is he trying to just ignore them down the stretch?
No, I think because it plays to really the way that he's going to able to galvanize support here going down the road. He needs his Republican base to continue to come out. If he's able to get the Republicans in this state to come out and back him, he's got in order to essentially convince them that these allegations are false. As he said, malicious. He released a campaign ad yesterday there, Steve, that he said it was part of a scheme by liberal elites and Republican establishment. Last night, for the first 15 minutes, he talked about these allegations. It's not something he's running from. He told the crowd, about 100 people there in a little remote town just up in the northeastern part of the state, that he said it was, quote, all the job of dirty politics. For Roy Moore, it's a matter of delegitimizing these women and really putting into people's minds that he is the man that they've known for decades. And when you talk to the voters here on the ground from across the state, there's a large constituency that believes him, and it gives that argument of why would they wait 30, 40 years, Steve?
All right, again, 2 weeks to go. Vaughn Hilliard camped out there in Alabama. He's probably not leaving anytime soon. Vaughn, thank you for that report. And let's take a look now where this race stands with 2 weeks to go until Election Day. Alabama, of course, it's the state of the Crimson Tide, although not after that Auburn game last weekend. But politically, Could it actually go blue in this December special election? Well, let's take a look at where this race stands. First of all, to reset things here, before all these allegations came out about Roy Moore, he was ahead by about 8 points when you average all the polls together here. Remember, Roy Moore, unusually polarizing for a Republican in Alabama, even before these accusations. So he was up 8, then all the allegations came forth. Now where do the polls stand? Well, you can see that's about as even as you can get. That is as even as you can get, 46.4 to 46.4 when you average all the polls together. Again, it has been more than 20 years since a Democrat was within single digits in a Senate race in Alabama. So this is one where, look, if you're a Democrat, if you're ever going to win a Senate election in Alabama, it's probably got to be this one. If you're Roy Moore, if you're a Republican, you're saying, look, hopefully the storm has sort of passed, and if this is the bottoming out point, maybe you can still get a victory from that one wild card we should tell you about, though. There is a third candidate now, a potential write-in candidate named Lee Busby, who stepped forward. He says he wants to run as a write-in. He says he's a Republican. Seems like he's interested in getting those Republicans who don't want to vote for a Democrat, may not be comfortable with Moore. Not a lot of indications he's going to have a lot of money or get a lot of attention here, but if he even got 1 or 2%, you can see in a race like this, that could make a difference. So that's something to keep an eye on. And again, remember, when we say this is a red state, this is what we mean. The last time a Democrat won a Senate race in Alabama, 1992. That was an incumbent being reelected. Richard Shelby, he switched parties. That's why the asterisk, because he didn't even stay a Democrat for his full term. The last time a Democrat won one and stayed a Democrat, it was Howell Heflin, 1990, his final term. Otherwise, just an ocean of red right there. That is what Doug Jones and the Democrats are up against. And, of course, the thing that upended this race in the first place, it was reporting by the Washington Post. They were the first to publish accounts from various women alleging unwanted sexual advances and misconduct by Roy Moore. Now, this morning, the paper is running a different type of story. It's posting an interview between one of their reporters and a woman they say tried to dupe them. That woman, Jamie Phillips, told the Post she conceived a child with Roy Moore when she was 15 years old. Now, in the process of trying to verify that, the Post found numerous inconsistencies in her story. They decided not to publish anything about it. It now appears she may have connections with Project Veritas. That's a right-wing group that's been trying to discredit media organizations with undercover video.
So if there's anything you want to say about why you're here and how you came to be sitting here, I really would like to know that story as well.
I mean, I really don't. I mean, I told you already that I wasn't even sure that I wanted to go through with the story at all.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So, I think I probably just want to cancel and not go through with it at this point.
And let me now bring in Callum Borchers. He's the media and politics reporter for the Washington Post. So, Callum, give us a little bit of context here. How did the Washington Post come to think that this story wasn't a legitimate story?
Yeah, I think there's a couple red flags that go up, right? I mean, so the first is that this woman's claim went much farther than previous accusers. Remember, our first report highlighted 4 women who claimed that Roy Moore had tried to pursue romantic relationships with them when they were in their teens and he was in his early 30s. One of the women, Lee Korfman, claimed that he had sexually touched her. This 5th woman, who came forward shortly after that story was published, claimed that Roy Moore had impregnated her and compelled her to get an abortion. So right away, you're going to get a lot of scrutiny when you make a strong claim like that. But then you also just look at some of the things that were sort of sloppy. For example, she failed to take down a GoFundMe page in which she had talked about moving to New York City to work in the conservative media movement and trying to discredit the mainstream media. And so, something like that, of course, is a big red flag right away. And then, the other little tidbits, one of our reporters described sitting with her at a table at a restaurant and her positioning her purse and then repositioning her purse in such a way that indicated she might have a hidden recording device. And then the bottom line is that, our journalists, just like those at many news organizations, are really, really careful with stuff like this. And I think that... And that's a testament to their good reporting.
And then the second part of this, too, is the potential connection to this thing called Project Veritas. James O'Keefe is the guy who runs that. His idea there is what you get folks to go in kind of undercover, hidden cameras. They talk to media, major media figures, and try to get them to sort of show bias or something like that. What the potential connection there, what do you know about that?
Yeah, James O'Keefe has been at this for a while with either news outlets or other outside groups, and he has had some success. You might say that one of his undercover sting operations basically crippled Acorn for good. So this is something to be on alert for, and I think that that's one of the things that I'm certainly mindful of, and I think other journalists are as well today, which is that while we ought to feel good about having sniffed this one out, and as I wrote about yesterday, there are some other examples recently of journalists, including your own Rachel Maddow at MSNBC, sniffing out a fraudulent NSA document that someone tried to dupe her into airing. Those are all good. That means we're doing our jobs, but I think we all still need to be on alert and not take too much of a victory lap, because I think that people like James O'Keefe are probably going to continue to try to do this sort of thing.
Yeah, that's good advice to keep in mind there. Callum Borchers from the Washington Post. Thank you for the time. Appreciate it. Bring back now the panel. Republican strategist Susan Del Percio, Democratic strategist Liz Smith, a veteran of Martin O'Malley's 2016 presidential campaign. Talk about this Alabama Senate race for a minute, but I am curious the effect of this story, this sort of fake story apparently that tried to peddle to the Washington Post. The Washington Post caught it. And, of course, you've got basically the Roy Moore campaign saying you can't trust this story in the Washington Post. Do you think this affects the race in any way, in that it makes people look at the original allegation a little differently?
No, look, I don't. I think it is part of this coordinated campaign on their part to sort of discredit everything. And we've just seen his backers become completely unhinged by all of these allegations. And it does fit into a larger pattern with Donald Trump and the Republican Party, where they're trying to, discredit the media, make it seem like the media is out to get them all. However, I don't think that this helps their case. I also don't think it really affects the race at all. I'm not sure how much voters in Alabama really care about a fake media sting against the Washington Post.
Let me ask about the other X factor in this race, and we mentioned it too a minute ago. This guy Lee Busby, Susan, who now says he's going to run as a write-in candidate, write his name in. He says he's a Republican, doesn't like either one of the candidates. He was on Morning Joe this morning and asked him about the allegations against Roy Moore. This is his answer to that. Take a look. Do you believe the allegation from Lee Korfman, who says she was sexually assaulted by Roy Moore at the age of 14?
Have no idea. I hadn't listened to her. I walked past the television and caught a brief snippet of it, but I'm not interested in that. Couldn't care less. That's between them.
Susan, I thought it was an interesting answer. I thought if you're running in a Republican primary against Roy Moore, I could imagine strategically maybe that's the answer. But I'm thinking of those voters in Alabama, suburbanites who typically vote Republican, aren't comfortable with Roy Moore in light of these stories. Is that the answer that's going to get them to write in this guy's name?
I saw the interview in its entirety, and I was a little surprised about the candidate because he really should have offered a more direct answer. I mean, this is basically what is unhinging Roy Moore. So I was surprised about that, but at any point, like you said, if it's 2 or 3 points, he can change the race. So I'll welcome his input. But one of the things that you mentioned earlier in that polling is that we're neck and neck, but we don't know what the turnout's going to look like. There's no model.
Who's going to show up?
We don't know who's going to
staying
show
home,
up.
who's coming out to the polls.
I just can't. I see that poll. It's so volatile right now. You can't figure out where anyone is. And there is a little bit of what we talked about in 2016. The folks who were supporting Donald Trump but wouldn't say so in a poll. Then there are people who, we always go after, as political operatives, we go after those likely voters. In this election, I'm sure that 80% of the people are saying they're likely voters, but I don't think they're all showing up. And I think that will hurt Roy Moore more likely.
And that's the other interesting number, too. The last time Roy Moore was on a ballot in Alabama, he was running for Chief Justice in 2012. 51.5%. This is not,
and behind,
10 points behind. So that already shows you there were Republicans in 2012. Now, of course, the X factor here, Senate race, federal office. Do you want to put a Democrat in Washington? Maybe that affects it, too. But he was polarizing even before this. Susan and Liz are going to stick around much more with them. Also, the feud over who should lead one of the nation's top financial agencies. It is now playing out in court. Why the future of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is caught between two administrations. In this tax reform.
You're watching MSNBC International.
Bill, about the timing, and about different portions of it, almost all of it on the business side. And a lot of these are people with whom the president does not have great relationships, Steve. But presidential aides, cabinet secretaries have been swarming the Hill over the last day or so, trying to win over some of these people. But it's going to be tough to do in the timeline that the White House has been talking about. I asked Senator Ron Johnson, who's one of the no votes, about that last night. Take a listen. Is the timeline of getting a vote on this week, you think, still realistic?
That is pretty optimistic. Okay, there's a lot of detail to work out in this. Everybody admits this is a problem that has to be fixed.
Are you going to vote for this bill?
I don't know. We're still working on it. I have some concerns on the deficit side.
What I don't want to do is be a part of something where I knowingly am involved in making that situation worse.
Hey, Steve, we're a little wobbly here trying to do some in-hallway interviews, but it just illustrates the point. I just tried to grab Marco Rubio coming down the hallway, who told me he's still worried about the child tax credit part of this. But he's not even somebody on our watch list. There are about a half a dozen other senators, as I mentioned before, who the White House has to be more worried about. Ron Johnson, who you just heard from, and Steve Daines from Montana, both usually vote for these priorities, but they're concerned about the business, small businesses, and how they're treated in this bill. And then the other side of this kind of seesaw, if you will, are the Bob Corkers and Jeff Flakes of the world, who are worried about how much it's going to cost and whether Congress is going to be willing to raise taxes later or to do something if all these rosy projections don't pan out. So there seems to be a constructive effort going on here between the White House and these senators to get something done, but the prospect of getting it done on this ever-shortening timeline seems really hung up right now, Steve.
All right, Garrett Hake there on Capitol Hill. Again, the president will be there later today. Now to the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue, NBC's Kristen Welker is at the White House. So, Kristen, the president is going to be heading over to Capitol Hill, trying to talk about and get through this tax reform plan. He's also going to be meeting with bipartisan leaders later today at the White House. What do we expect there?
High-stakes meetings on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue today, Steve. To his first meeting, the president, I think his main message is going to be this is a once-in-a-generation chance to get tax reform passed. He's going to be looking to swap those no votes to yes, and all of those folks who are sitting on the fence, who Garrett was just talking about, those dozen or so senators who've expressed some real skepticism about the tax bill that is coming together. In terms of his afternoon, later his meeting this afternoon here at the White House, high stakes there as well, Steve. He's going to be meeting with congressional leaders of both parties, and that's where they're going to discuss the broader GOP and Trump agenda. And at the top of that list is going to be the December 8th deadline to try to get a spending deal passed to make sure that the government doesn't partially shut down. Here's what's at stake. Democrats want to attach some type of a DACA fix to that spending bill. Based on my conversations with Republicans, it doesn't seem as though there's a real appetite for that. And of course, this is going to be another one of those meetings between the president and Chuck and Nancy, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. Those are the nicknames that he gave them after he cut a deal with them about 3 months ago on a short-term spending package. But the president signaling today it's not going to be a green light when it comes to that DACA deal, saying meeting with Chuck and Nancy today about keeping government open and working. Problem is, they want illegal immigrants flooding into our country unchecked, are weak on crime, and want to substantially raise taxes. I don't see a deal. Steve, we'll be watching very closely to see if that changes.
And Kristen, while we have you there, stand by because I want to ask you about this as well. Speaking of nicknames, it was yesterday a ceremony at the White House, the president with Native American war heroes. He found a way to work in a nickname, if you want to call it that he's been using for Elizabeth Warren. Take a look.
And I just want to thank you because you're very, very special people. You were here long before any of us were here. Although we have a representative in Congress who they say was here a long time ago. They call her Pocahontas. But you know what? I like you.
Kristen, I mean, you could say it's sort of a breach of traditional decorum. There's people who say that's a slur there. What is the White House saying about this?
The White House is pushing back forcefully. They say, look, Senator Elizabeth Warren wasn't forthcoming when during her academic career she claimed that she had Native American ancestry. If you go back to fact checkers, they say there's no actual proof of that. Elizabeth Warren has said that she's been told that she has Native American ancestry by other family members. But again, nothing in paper, nothing that she's been able to put forward to actually show that. Take a look at some of the heated exchanges yesterday with Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
I think what most people find offensive is Senator Warren lying about her heritage to advance her career.
Now, she said it was a racial slur. She said it was a racial slur. What is your response to that?
I think that's a ridiculous response.
Is it appropriate for the president to use a racial slur in any context?
I don't believe that it is appropriate for him to make a racial slur or anybody else.
This is a racial slur, so why is it appropriate for him to
Well, I think, like I said, I don't think that it is, and I don't think that was certainly not the president's intent.
Steve, important to point out the president is up and tweeting today about the economy, the NFL, his meeting with Chuck and Nancy. He hasn't tweeted about this controversy. It may be a sign that he really wants to try to turn the page and focus on tax reform and his broader agenda, Steve.
All right, Kristen Welker there at the White House. Kristen, thanks for that. And let's bring in our panel for this hour. We have Republican strategist Susan Del Percio and Democratic strategist Liz Smith. Let's start on that point that Kristen just made there. The president, when he sets these things off sometimes, like he did yesterday with that comment about Elizabeth Warren, you do often see him follow up on Twitter. He likes the reaction it generates. We saw this with the NFL. He sort of takes it and runs with it. Kristen saying maybe, one way to read this, maybe he's focused actually for once here on the actual legislative agenda. Do you think there's something to that, or do you think in 2 hours we got an Elizabeth Warren tweet?
Who knows? That's the thing with Donald Trump is we don't know. And the fact that he's so unpredictable, the fact that he shows such a lack of respect for the Oval Office, for the job he's doing, to the people that he recognized at that ceremony, is just what constantly hurts his agenda. And frankly, it's what has him at a 33 to 38% approval rating in this country. The president, and we'll talk about like getting onto his bigger agenda, what is his tax plan? I don't think he can tell you. He's for some kind of tax cuts, we know that, but he doesn't put the effort into knowing what his legislative agenda is about. And that's what's really, when we talk about all these other ancillary remarks, and as offensive as the Pocahontas remark was, it's more offensive that he's not doing the people's work.
Well, what we know is he likes the idea of a win. He likes the idea, Liz, of having the signing ceremony, saying I got one through. So I think that's the prism he's looking at tax reform, tax cuts through, whatever you want to call them. He wants the win. Whatever's in the bill, he'll sign it. He wants to say he did it. Republicans, I think, are looking at this and saying, look, we have to have something to show for majority in the House, majority in the Senate, White House. It's got to be this. Otherwise, we're in trouble with the voters in 2018. I'm looking at the polling on this, though, this tax plan, and I'm saying, I don't know. You're a Democrat. Politically, would you rather run against a Republican Party in 2018 that passes this or that doesn't pass it?
You will absolutely. So, look, if this passes, and that's a big if, it will be in spite of, not because of anything that Donald Trump did, because of, as you said, all the distractions, his lack of focus, his lack of any focus on the particulars of this bill. However, to your point, as a Democrat, I would rather run against a party that passes this bill. Look at the headlines on it. The headlines about the CBO reporter saying that this tax reform bill helps corporations, that it hurts the poorest Americans most. And when people were out there saying, "Oh, we need tax reform," there weren't Americans out there saying, "Oh, we need to give corporations a bigger tax cut." And so it's going to be politically toxic for them, and it feeds into a good Democratic argument.
And that was, Susan, at the very end of health care, of Obamacare repeal over the summer, that seemed to be, most Republicans were willing to go along with it. They weren't enthusiastic, but just enough there. You had John McCain at the end who came out and cast that decisive vote. And it seemed like the attitude of Republicans was, yeah, we promised this for 7 years ago, but it's better not to do it. Could that enter into the equation with taxes, too?
Well, no, I think that the tax cuts are something that has to happen. Let's make it clear. This will not be tax reform by any stretch of the imagination. Just this morning, there were press reports of naming dozens of itemized things that have been lobbied for and now put back in as far as tax incentives for special interests. So this is going to be some form of a tax cut. That being said, the Republicans do need to go back to the district to say we did do something. What I'm curious about is, fine, I take Liz's point, but at the same time, what are the Democrats going to run on? What have they done? And that's going to be nothing.
And we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but that is also an interesting aspect to this, too. Donald Trump, who won those Democratic states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, he has not done anything legislatively to put the Democrats in those states on the defensive and make them choose between his agenda and those voters. And I'm not seeing it right now. We'll talk about it more later. We have to squeeze a quick break in, I'm hearing here. But with the panel is sticking around for the hours. This conversation has just begun. Stay with us, and more coming up, including Roy Moore. He is stepping back into the spotlight for a campaign event this after nearly 2 weeks away from the cameras. We're going to break down the latest in the Alabama Senate race. Take a look at the polls. It's a very close race there. Plus, the Washington Post now saying a woman tried to deceive its reporters with a new accusation against Moore. Those details as well next.
You're watching MSNBC International.
I love the magic of politics. I love the sheer
of sexual misconduct. Deanna Marr, Conyers' former deputy chief of staff, tells the Detroit News that Conyers made unwanted sexual advances toward her, including inappropriate touching. She says the 3 incidents happened between 1997 and 1999. NBC News has not independently verified these claims. Conyers' lawyer says his client denies any wrongdoing. Joining us from Washington is Deborah Katz, an attorney specializing in sexual harassment and employment law. Deborah, help me sort this one out here, because it seems to me there's an interesting dilemma brewing with this issue of sexual harassment and Congress, where you have word of these settlements that have been paid out, these sort of quiet, secret settlements that have been paid out involving conduct from members of Congress that taxpayers unwittingly funded and that taxpayers now want details about. But you may have cases here where the victims say, this is something I don't want getting aired publicly. How do you decide what's in the public interest between those two sides of it?
Well, the law as written is completely stacked to conceal all of this. It's not that there is this fund that people don't know about. It's exactly in the law. So from the very beginning, when the complainant has to go to this Office of Compliance and sign away their rights to talk about this and agree to confidentiality through mandatory counseling, which is really a misnomer, it's just an intake process, through mandatory mediation, through mandatory cooling off periods, it really is designed to silence the victim. It gives all the power to the member, and then ultimately the victim of harassment has to decide whether they're going to go public, which is absolutely career killing, or enter into a confidential agreement. And many people that we've represented, agree to enter into confidential agreements. They receive very little money in these settlements, but what they're getting is privacy and the right to go forward. I absolutely understand and respect the desire of the public to unmask these members, but from our client's perspective, there are huge career ramifications if they also get unmasked.
So you're putting out what is a barrier, a very legitimate barrier, I think, in terms of somebody trying to grapple with a victim, trying to grapple with how to approach this. So in terms of reform, in terms of how things should change, how should this work going forward? If a member of Congress sexually harasses a staffer and a staffer wants to take action and has those fears you're now talking about, how should the system work?
Well, I actually like Jackie Spears' Me Too Congress law. It gives the victim the ability to say, I'm not entering into a confidentiality agreement. I want to go forward. But even if that victim doesn't want to do that, there would be mandatory reporting to the Ethics Committee and to other entities within Congress that could investigate the member. At least there's going to be a record. Right now we have these secret settlements that, as we know through the Conyers case, actually ran through his budget by reinstating somebody who was terminated and paying her this as severance. There's not going to be a record. Everybody is talking about this slush fund, this money that's paid through the federal treasury, and that's how the law is designed, is to have settlements paid through the federal treasury. But in fact, there's an end run of that, and the Office of Compliance is approving settlements that simply give typically women severance for a short period of time in exchange for a lifetime non-disclosure agreement.
Let me bring the panel in too on some of these specific cases we're talking about. Liz, look, you've got, I think there's things colliding here, and people would say these are not the same things, but I'm wondering when you look at this race in Alabama and the question of, wow, all these voters who are sticking with Roy Moore in the face of this, and then you look at these scandals in Washington, and you've got Conyers now, and Pelosi made some comments on Sunday that some people said, wow, she surprised she didn't go farther than that, and Conyers has now stepped down temporarily as the ranking member on the Judiciary Committee. You had Al Franken yesterday apologizing, but it wasn't clear what he was apologizing for. Are Democrats seizing this moment sufficiently?
No. We are falling down on the job. And it's time for us to say, enough is enough. Whether you're a sexual harasser or a groper, you have no place being in Congress. And who the heck are we to go out there and lecture Republicans about Roy Moore when we have the appearance of enabling and protecting these guys? And, if we want to be leaders on this issue, we have to be unequivocal on this, and we have to stand up for women and protect them and say that these people have no place in our party. And until we do that, you know what? We just have no moral high ground.
Susan, very quickly, psychologically, is that a factor here in Alabama? A voter looking at this and saying, I'm not sure about Moore, but look at that. They're protecting Franken. They're protecting Conyers.
Well, in Alabama, I also think you have a pro-choice versus a pro-life candidate, which is a big issue when it comes to voters in Alabama. They're extremely pro-life. So they may be willing to look the other way or say, I don't believe those allegations. But just to follow up on one of the things that your previous guest said, is look towards campaign accounts to see where other payoffs will have been made, because that's the next line that people are going to look at.
Good tip there. Susan Del Percio, Deborah Katz, I want to say thank you to you first, and Susan Del Percio and Liz Smith, thanks as well for sticking around with us this hour. And newly released video providing more details about an American citizen jailed in Iran. Now his wife is speaking out why Iran's government has sentenced the grad student to 10 years behind bars and what American leaders are saying about his case. That's next.